Everybody to our May luncheon. My name is Cindy Gueli. I am president of AOI this year. And we welcome all of you, all of our members, our new members, and guests to our meeting. We have a recap of our April meeting with one of our newest members, John Lockwood, who talked about the Siege of Washington. And that we have an account in our newsletter, on our website, and on the YouTube channel. We have that video. And if there are no objections, I will enter that into the record to make that our official account of our April meeting. Any objections to that? No, great, all right. If you have not checked out our YouTube channel yet, there are some great videos on there, also from our speakers. If you didn't get a chance to come to any of the lunches, you can certainly catch up with those. But Bill also he's in charge of our YouTube channel, and he put some other interesting videos on there as well. So take a look. You can always find us by Googling AOI of DC and find us that way. I am going to quickly pass this on to Carolyn, who is going to give us our membership report.
So we don't have any new members to introduce today, but we do have a lot of visitors. And so I'll start with guests of my sister, Cheryl Chapman Henderson, Sharon Lucas, and Corliss McPherson. They're visitors and hopefully potential new members. Is there anything you'd like to say?
Thank you for having us. We're very interested in this. We both were born in 1953, so I think we qualify.
I think we qualify too.
Are there any other visitors that would like to introduce themselves?
I'd like to introduce my nephew, Brian McCaig. Brian is a seventh-generation native Washingtonian, and he's back home after a stint in Milwaukee and Boston, and we're awfully glad to have him back home where he belongs.
Yeah.
And his uncle, John Daly, was a past director of the AOI.
Ah,
Welcome.
welcome.
Anybody else? Any other visitors? I thought we had more visitors. We did, but some people are shy today. So I'll pass it on back to you.
Do we need to vote on the new member? To vote our new member in?
Yes, we do, but I need to find their name. I'm sorry. There's always next month, and maybe
We'll do
the
it
new
next
member will
month.
come
All right,
next
we'll do it next month. We'll keep it in mind. Thank you. Now we can vote on more, because hopefully we'll have more new members for next month that we'll be able to vote in. Well, a couple of updates on some of the events that we've had. We had a busy spring for AOI. We did have as you know, a table at the networking session for the DC History Conference, where we were able to share knowledge about AOI, and also participated in the Collecting DC History Day at the Hierarch House Museum. And thank you all for those of you who came out. It was kind of a drizzly, cold day, so appreciate it all the more to be outside for that. We did have a great result from that. We had somebody who stopped by who told us that they had just given their grandfather's papers to the DC Library, to the People's Archives. And in those papers were connections to the African American AOI. And that gives us more information that we have been trying to collect on that organization and the connections between the two. So those have not been processed yet, but she has invited us to come to the library to go over it with her and to look at those papers and to see what else we can find out about our own history. So that alone was fantastic and a great result, and I think that most of the organizations that were involved felt that it was worthwhile and that we will possibly be doing that again in the future. So thank you for all of you who came out for that. We do have on the table in the back from where you check in is a sheet if you're interested. This is a little resource guide that we put together about collecting DC history and places that everybody who was involved with it, and websites and phone numbers, in case you do have something that you uncover in your house, in your files, and you're trying to figure out where that should go. This can be kind of a starter Q&A and an information guide. So we'll have this on our website, but if you want to pick one up on your way out, definitely take a look. A few things coming up that you might be interested in. On May 22nd, there is the launch of the Washington History magazine, the spring issue. And that is going to be, I am not familiar with this, so it could be fun just to go if you are not familiar with it either. The Right Proper Brewing Company in Brookland. If nobody, I think they have a place in Shaw and a place in Brookland. This is an event that is free. And there will be some light snacks, some Senate beer that you can sip, and hear about the latest issue of the Washington History magazine. More information is on the DC History Center website if you're interested in that. On May 20, actually I'm gonna backtrack because this is May 29th. This weekend, I was just hearing about there is a walk around, a free, I forgot what it's called, but you can walk around to the different DuPont Calorama museums for free this weekend. From 11 to 4, you can go to the Phillips House, Phillips Museum, Anderson House, Dumbarton House, and a couple of others, the O Museum, Woodrow Wilson. All of those are going to be free this weekend. So if it is going to, I think they said 100% chance of rain on Saturday. So if you are looking something inside to do, that might be a good place to start. On May 29th, on Zoom, the DC Preservation League is having a discussion on historic preservation and affordable housing, myth and reality. And that is also free, and you can watch that in the comfort of your own home, raining or not. That is a noontime event, and you can go to the DC Preservation League website to get more information and to register for that. Busy month, National Capital Planning Commission is having an event, a panel discussion and a discussion on its role in shaping Washington, and also the launch of an exhibit at MLK Library. And that is on June 6th at 6 p.m. Everything I'm talking to you about today is for free, so that will also be for free, and you can go to the NCPC website for more information and to register for that. Before we meet next month is going to be Capitol Pride in DC. So there are many different events, but of course one of the biggest ones is the parade, which is going to be Saturday, June 8th. There is a new route. Yes, there is a new route this year. It's going to be going down 14th Street and then Pennsylvania Avenue. They are expecting more people than normal, and it's been growing every year, so they're trying to accommodate more people. It's getting ready for next year's big, which is going to be even bigger. So that is new this year. You can see that from, I think it's 3 to maybe 7 or so. And then there is going to be the Capitol Pride concert, Sunday, the June 9th. That's 12 to 10, and that is on Pennsylvania Avenue because there's also going to be a festival there. And the concert, I believe one of the headliners is Billy Porter is going to be performing this year. And if you don't know, yes, that was my expression when I heard Billy Porter. So if you don't know Billy Porter, the jaw drop is the expression that you would have if you do know him and his performance. So that's going to be for free on June 9th. You may know, but I just discovered there is a newsletter and podcast around called CityCast DC. And that has daily stories and lists of events. And since we keep talking about the lack of local reporting and local information, this might be a way to go ahead and get that into your email daily, both the podcast and the newsletter. And again, it is called CityCast DC. And you can Google that and go to that website and take a look at it. We have one other kind of big news, which I'm going to pass the microphone on to Bill to share, that will connect some of our past with something that he found. Bill.
Thank you, Cindy. Well, 2 weeks from today is Memorial Day, as you all may realize. And 2 years ago, Memorial Day, was when AOI dedicated the wayside that we had put together at 16th and Alaska Avenue for this DC World War I 16th Street Tree Memorial. Walter's going to bring that slide up in just a second. That's Kim's. Here we go. There you are. So this wayside commemorated the 530 DC World War I veterans that perished one way or the other in World War I. And it was made possible, the majority of the funds came from AOI, but the state region of the DAR for DC contributed to it, and DC Water, gift in kind, contributed their space. So this wayside is on the wall of DC Water, and it lists the five, at the time when it was dedicated in 1920, it lists the 507 names of the fallen that were selected at the time, and a map as to where all of these memorials were located along a 2-mile stretch of 16th Street commemorating these people. Now, this is separate from the DC War Memorial down on the mall, okay? And as I was discussing with Barbara Bates, we have these huge spreadsheets trying to reconcile and sort everything. There are people on one memorial that are not on the other, and vice versa, and we attribute that to the fact that when the DC War Memorial was done in 1932, that they'd had another 10 years to vet some of these people and say, well, they didn't really participate or whatever, so they may not be included among the 499. 2 years after the 507 were dedicated, another 23 were added. So Walter, can you click ahead to my next slide? I don't have the, do I? Oh, here it is. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, so there are the names, there's the map. So as of today, and as we've accumulated over the years, there are only 3 known locations of the, we call them the stumps, of where these original copper medallions were placed along 16th Street. This is what you see if you go to one of those locations, okay? It was just a 4-inch square concrete pillar with a copper shield on it with the name and branch of service for each of these 530 people. Originally 507, 23 added later. There is only one existing one until recently, and that is for John Forsyth Diggs, and this is in Council Chair Phil Mendelson's office. John Kelly wrote about this a number of years ago, that somebody had found this in their backyard, and in his article he more or less said, well, if you don't want to be accused of harboring, having stolen property, you should, donate this someplace. In so many words, I think that was sort of off the record. So anyhow, John Briggs's ended up, is it Briggs or Diggs? Diggs ended up in Phil Mendelson's office, and this gives you sort of an idea. Oh, so anyhow, it's on the concrete plinth in his office. And all this is on our website, so you can track this down. So this is where it sort of gets interesting. So earlier this year, we get an email from somebody saying, my father-in-law used to live along 16th Street, and he happens to have this in his collection. Well, this is for Daniel Benzinger, U.S. Army. And if you do the research on it, Daniel Benzinger was 27 when he died in World War I, and his family had an automotive repair and truck repair place in D.C. I've actually reached out and contacted his descendants. He didn't have any progeny, but he had a brother who had, and his third cousin, X number of times removed, lives in Colorado. And we've been back in touch over this because, and this is where it gets interesting. So remember I said that there were 23 added in 1922? We don't know the names of any of those 23. None of them. Barbara has researched it. We think American Forests might have it. The newspaper account of February 6, 1922 says 23 more names to be added to the DC War Memorial, and then it doesn't list their names. It's like, so on our big spreadsheet, we have a number of World War I veterans that are on one, not the other, and some that aren't on either. And you'd think, oh, I'll go into Excel and I'll sort through this, and bingo, these 23 will pop out. Benzinger wasn't even on any of those lists. So somewhere, along with Daniel Benzinger, are 22 other people who we don't have the names for, even though their memorials were dedicated in 1922. So we need to find out these other 22 people in addition to Daniel Benzinger. So in a moment of, I don't know, craziness, I'm Googling and eBaying and doing all kinds of stuff a couple weeks ago, and I find this memorial tree, World War I, 1917, 1918, William P. Slater, U.S. Coast Guard. And he was on our list. He was number 409, and his memorial was on 16th Street at, between Decatur and Blagden, opposite Emerson Street. He's listed as Slattery, William Patrick, boy, first class, U.S. Coast Guard, mother, Mrs. Margaret McLean, 836 5th Street Northeast, Washington, D.C., USS Gresham, escorted vehicle, died at Naval Hospital, Norfolk, Virginia, respiratory disease, October 5th, 1918. So we've got the plaque or the shield in Phil Mendelssohn's office. We've got the one that's out there, the Benzinger one that's floating around out there, and the father-in-law who's moved 500 miles away that we're sort of trying to politely convince to donate to the DC archives. And, of course, going on eBay, I get the third one. So I'll pass this around and everyone can look at it. So we're hoping, probably beyond hope, that somehow magically, and the best bet is if American Forests has this list of the 23 that were added, that we'd be able to go ahead and populate. I mean, the names may be on our list, but at least we could categorize them and say, 508. I've just gone ahead and added Benzinger in randomly as number 508. We don't know whether it was an A or a B before him or not, but I've just, used some executive, prerogative and made him 508. What we need is 509 through 530 to complete the mystery. So I thought that would be appropriate, maybe put on certain thinking caps or check our website. Barbara has done such an excellent job with the 10 women on the DC memorials, the African-American men on the DC memorials, because on these, both memorials, there's no indication as to gender, rank, ethnicity, or anything. I mean, they're just names. So we've accumulated that over time and have that in our spreadsheet, which is on the website if you want to research it further. So another mystery for us to work on. Thank you.
So excited. I thought these shields, when we kept seeing the pictures of it, I thought these shields were like huge on a tree. So when you pass around and you see it and it's so tiny, it's amazing that these survived at all, that are out there. So if you all happen to be on eBay and up late one night and can't sleep, let us know if you find anything. Keep an eye out. Keep an eye out for more.
I didn't mention that sadly this one has been buffed up, or somebody has used, Brasso or something on it, because the other ones have oxidized as the copper would over years. So in a way, a preservationist would say, well, that's not good. But in the one that's going around, that is what they look like originally.
Well, and I also did not realize they were copper from the pictures until looking at this. So do not polish anything if you find it. Do not clean up anything that you find. But I'm glad somebody did so we could see it, at least for this one. For it. Thank you. Thank you both, and thank you for all your work, Barbara, on this. We would not have this information without you, so thank you, Barbara. I am going to bring Nelson up for trivia, and as I do that, I will come on up. But I do want to mention we have one more event, if you're interested. It's going to be taking place here at the WNDC on Tuesday, May 28th. It might be a nice way to celebrate the end of the month with a wine tasting, an Italian wine tasting. It's Sartorelli wine, and I think you have sheets on some of your tables that are there. But it's also posted at the front door. But it's a reception. It is pairings of the Italian wine with some absolutely amazing food. And it is $135 per seat, $1,000 for a table of 8 if you want to invite your friends or family. And to take a look and come back, because we know how good the food is here. I can imagine once they're going Italian with all of these wines should be absolutely amazing event. So keep that in mind. Nelson. Okay. Or DC history.
Okay, the first question is from remarks to the Association of the Oldest Inhabitants, this group, delivered at a meeting on April 7th, 1880. We're going back here. We were operating. I don't know how many people showed up. A Mr. Lambert Tree, who stated he was born October 14, 1799, told the story of how he left his hometown in Philadelphia for the city of Washington in 1820 at the age of 21 to take up residence here and begin a career in the U.S. Postal Service. His journey from Philadelphia to Washington took 4 days, traveling by water, transport, and stagecoach. His first impressions were of the developing Capitol Hill community, where he noted that gravel sidewalks were being improved from mere pathways. The question is, what paving material was being used in these improvements? Pardon?
Oyster shells, they said. Oyster shells.
Oh, well, that's a good one. That might have been, but it wasn't the improvement he has cited anyway. It was probably an improvement over the muddy ones he was talking about. Brick, yes. And this impressed me because I live on Capitol Hill. His recollections are about 6 blocks. He talked about roving around the Capitol for 3 days, Capitol area, Capitol Hill, 6 blocks from the Capitol building. And so I live 6 blocks from the Capitol building. And guess what? Today, all the streets in our residential neighborhood are brick. So nothing changed. In how many years? 1820 till today, we got brick. A lot of people are complaining about the brick today, but that's another question.
Where was the brickyard?
Anybody know where the brickyard was? Okay.
Is that correct? Oh, okay.
After describing the many improvements in his, they were printed up at the time. This is his talk. He had it printed, and I found a copy of it in the archives of the Committee on the District of Columbia, where I worked many years ago. That's how I found it. I didn't find this in the archives that we know of the AOI. How it got to the Capitol Hill, I don't know. After describing the many improvements he had seen during his lifetime, Mr. Tree observed that after 60 years as a resident, including the era of Governor Alexander Shepard, he predicted that despite not being held in high esteem in 1880, when he delivered his address, one day Shepard would be honored for helping to make Washington the grand city it would become. didn't give the rules. I have another trivia question, but we'd like to give them out to anybody who hasn't won before, so we try that to begin with. And raise your hand, just don't jump up and give the answer, and we'll have the other trivia question. In 1790, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson sent a memorandum to President George Washington recommending that the heights of residential and commercial construction in the planned federal city be limited by regulation. Jefferson cited the example of a national capital city that had successfully, for over 200 years at that time, had limited the heights of residential and commercial buildings by both custom and regulation. Such regulations, Jefferson wrote, quote, keep the houses low and convenient, and the streets light and airy, and fires are much more manageable when houses are low. Jefferson was citing an example of what national capital city? Well, that was a capital at the time of the temporary capital of the United States at the time, but that's not it. He was not citing capital. In fact, he had many criticisms about Philadelphia and the way it was laid out at the time, and shouldn't be used in the development of the federal city. Paris. Who said Paris? Paris. Okay, you're a winner. Okay. In 1791, acting on the recommendations of Jefferson, Washington issued the first building regulations for private and commercial development. The building should be no higher than 40 feet and no lower than 35 feet. I might add that years ago I found pictures in the archives of the Committee on the District of Columbia of alleys in the city. And it was interesting that some of the buildings on the alleys themselves were 2 and 3 stories higher than the buildings that were facing on the streets in the adjacent areas. So I don't know if that was a loophole at times in some of the regulations or they were just ignored, but that's an interesting fact. Maybe our speaker today knows something about that. And I do have a few copies of Mr. Lee Tree. It's Tree, by the way, Tree. It's an unusual name of his remarks before the. I might add that on the building heights, I have some copies, 2 or 3 page copies here of a little history of the building height regulation historically in the city over the last 200 years. And interestingly, Eleanor Holmes Norton has been introducing bills to restrict to really take away or to give the power to the city council to change building heights. In the city charter, they cannot change some of the major building height regulations that were enacted by Congress over the years. And she also has bills in to essentially do away with the Commission of Fine Arts and other federal agencies that are involved in regulating development in the city. And so stay tuned. She may be chairman of the powerful committee in the next Congress, and we'll see some action on these. And of course, the Association of Oldest Inhabitants historically has been very interested in these issues and has testified on the Hill in the past when there have been major efforts to change the building height laws. So stay tuned.
We'll also put that account, the AOI account from Mr. Tree on our website. So if you want to take a look at that, you can see it on there as well. Nelson, I love that you always connect your trivia questions to what we're doing today. So thank you for leading us into the built environment so that I can introduce our speaker for today, who has been involved with the built environment of DC for many years. Kim Protho Williams is an architectural historian as well as the National Register Coordinator at the DC Historic Preservation Office. Lucky for us, she has a particular interest in researching local history and urban planning developments in and around DC, and has written several books, heritage trail booklets, websites, blog posts, articles, all dealing with the built environment of this area. She last spoke to us in 2018 about her book, Lost Farms and Estates of Washington, D.C. So you probably remember her from that. And also, that is on our website if you would like to revisit that or visit that talk. Today, she's here to talk to us about her book, Hidden Alleyways of Washington, D.C., A History, which looks at the spaces around D.C. that were never meant to be observed. So we are going to observe them today with Kim. So without further ado, I turn it over to Kim. With your clicker.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Cindy, and thank you all for coming out and letting me speak to you today about my recent book on alleys. Alleys are very interesting, and the DC alleys are particularly interesting because they are different from alleys in any other American city. They were both centers of habitation, centers of commerce and industry, and they also came to house a good number of artistic communities. So my book sort of touches on all aspects of the social and physical history of DC's alleys. And just to back up a little bit about my role as an architectural historian at the DC Historic Preservation Office, this book really came out of my job at the DC Historic Preservation Office because we oversee alterations and additions to buildings that are in historic districts, and many of our historic districts date to the 1970s or 80s, and we had not done thorough surveys of all of the buildings in our historic districts. So we were not always able to evaluate the alterations and additions on these buildings. And in particular, these older historic districts, we had not looked at the alleyways. And so in recent years, especially in our downtown historic districts, 14th Street and U Street, there was a lot of pressure in our alley buildings. Developers are looking to build back into the alleys, and we were getting a lot of raise applications on our alley buildings. And so we just said we need to understand our alley buildings, so I decided I was going to do an alley building survey. And this survey took about 3 summers. I had interns, volunteers, and helpers who went out and walked every single alley in the cities, in the original city, and some of the subdivisions just on the outside, like LaDroit Park, for instance, in Mount Pleasant. But in the process, we collected information on all of the alley buildings, and then we researched them and included them in a database so that we could really understand which buildings were important for what reasons. And so it was in the process of doing this architectural survey that I really uncovered this incredible history, social history of Washington and where people lived. So I am going to start the presentation just telling you a little bit about alleys, and actually this is quite interesting because it does involve the 1791 building regulations that were written by George Washington. But as you all know, this is the L'Enfant Plan. This is the plan for the original city of Washington, laid out by engineer and architect Peter L'Enfant in 1791. And it included the streets and the public reservations and city squares, but it actually did not, this original plan did not include alleyways. However, we know that alleys were likely intended from the start because in George Washington's 1791 building regulations, it notes that passages into the squares may be arched or gated with permission from the DC commissioners. So we know that if there were passageways leading into the interior of the square that could be gated, that then there were alleys at the interior of the square. So we were pretty certain that from the beginning, the early city planners planned on having alleys in the city. And sure enough, between 1792 and 1796, those all the individual squares for the city were surveyed and platted, and each of the individual squares included alleys. This is a detail of a map, a later map showing the alleys. This is a detail on Capitol Hill. And you can see that the alleys were different from any other American city where the alleys cut through the entire block from one side to the other. In DC, the alleys came in different configurations depending on the configuration of the actual square. But by far, the largest percentage of alleys had either an I-shaped form or an H-shaped form. And you can see that. Does this have a pointer or a laser pointer on it? Yes, okay. So here you can see I-shaped alleys here, and these are H-shaped alleys here. Now, what made these even more interesting is that these were wide alleyways. They were like 30 feet wide at the center, but they were entered from the public streets by these very, very narrow alleys that were 10 feet wide or 15 feet wide in maximum width, which made these alleys hidden from the public streets. And for that reason, they became known as hidden alleys or blind alleys. And that was, unique to the city. So here is one of those early plats. This one dates from 1792, and this is a plat of what's known as Brown's Court today. It's on Capitol Hill. And you can see here, this is the very narrow 15-foot wide alley that came off of the main public street, and it went back to this I-shaped alley 30 feet wide. Now, the width of the alley is important because this was intended for horses and wagons to be able to turn around at the center of the square, and it was a way to get goods to the backs of these very, very deep lots that went from the public street all the way back to the alley. And these lots often extended 100 feet or deeper. And so you can see, there had to be access there. And the interesting thing is when you look at the configuration of the squares, the alleys all have different configurations so that every lot would have access to the alley. So originally, it was anticipated that the houses would all be built on the front part of the lot, and that the rear of the lot would really be for gardens or domestic outbuildings, maybe even enslaved quarters, vegetable gardens, ornamental gardens, and the like. This is a watercolor that was done in 1852 that kind of gives an illustration of what the original city planners had expected the direction the city would develop. This was done by Montgomery Meigs, who I'm sure most of you know, architect and engineer who developed the Washington Aqueduct, the water system, brought water from Great Falls into the city. He was a bit of an artist on the side, and this is just an incredibly rare painting that he did showing the backyards at the rear of a house between 12th and 13th Streets and along K Street. And it's just an amazing watercolor because you can see this view to the alley. The alley is actually on the left there, and to the backyards that had these ornamental gardens, these domestic outbuildings, and people tending the gardens in the back. But as you know, or as we all know, things do not always turn out as planned. And during the mid to late 19th century, as the city's population was increasing, owners and real estate developers created greater housing opportunities by subdividing the large city lots. To begin with, they subdivided these really large city lots width-wise, which created more urban-sized, narrow lots that really allowed for row houses that really characterize our city today. But they not only did that, sorry about that, they not only divided them width-wise, they also divided them lengthwise. And this increased almost 8-fold the number of lots available for a developer or an owner to then build upon and get a better return on his investment. And here you can see they would divide them lengthwise into what became what we call alley lots. So these alley lots only had frontage on the alleys. These alley lots had no access to the public street. And then oftentimes between, so this is the public street out here. These are the alley lots. And then oftentimes there were narrow alleys then placed between the public street lots and the alley lots, creating a very sort of insular community that would eventually develop in the alleyways. So here is an example from the late 19th century and the early 20th century photograph on the right of how these alleys developed. So this is Blagden Alley, Naylor Court on the left, and you can see the pink-colored buildings are brick buildings. If they have an X in them, they're stables or some kind of warehouse-type structure. If they don't have a designation, sometimes they have Ds on them for dwelling, but otherwise they are, these indicate dwellings. But so you can see how the backs of the front-facing lots have back buildings, and the alley buildings have alley lots on them. Some of them, they're sort of between the alleys. Here they face each other, here their backs are to each other. But they created these very insular communities, which you can see in this historic photograph here, where this is the interior of an alley. The houses on the alley are looking towards one another and are very separate and hidden from the public right of way. This is Willow Street Alley in Southwest. It no longer exists. And we all know from going to restaurants and cafes that Blagden Alley does still exist, but the dwellings in Blagden Alley have been converted to new uses. So before the Civil War, there were 49 separate alleys housing 350 households. The majority of the residents in the alleys at that time were white and generally immigrant workers who were moving into the city for employment. But during and after the Civil War, when there were thousands of African Americans who streamed into the city seeking new life and new jobs, the construction of alley dwellings intensified. With few resources available, the incoming residents built makeshift housing as quickly as possible and wherever they could. And I was looking at newspaper articles, and there was one from 1865 that noted that all sorts and sizes of them may be found wedged in every conceivable shape into spaces and yards and alleys. And these early alley dwellings were commonly described as mean cabins, having dirt floors, walls of boards with holes, and roofs of tin, tar, felt, and rags. And this is a photograph from around the turn of the century, actually, but showing a Civil War era frame dwelling. So by 1871, there were over 1,500 people living in alley houses. There was no plumbing, there was no heat, there was no insulation, and no sewage systems in the alleyways. There were common water pumps and outhouses. Oftentimes, they were shared between alleys, so not every alley even had its own water pump and outhouse. Oh, there we go. So there were housing reformers and humanitarians who were just appalled by the unhealthy and unsanitary living conditions. And so they began to condemn alley dwellings very early on as being unfit for human habitation, starting really in 1871, really and just immediately after the construction of these dwellings after the Civil War. And their government lobbying actually resulted in the first series of building regulations that the city adopted in the early 1870s, 1872. And these regulations would actually dictate the typology for alley dwellings for the next 20 years. And so these regulations forbade wooden buildings, so no longer would any alley dwellings be built of wood, but they would all be built of brick. They established minimum widths, and that minimum width was 12 feet. So, of course, every alley dwelling was 12 feet wide. They weren't going to make it 1 inch wider than they had to. And it required that each dwelling had to have either an outhouse or a toilet. So there were no more outhouses serving an entire alley or two alleys. So that was definitely an improvement. And then you can see this plan over here. This was drawn by my colleague. This is the typical plan of an alley dwelling. They were 2 stories tall, 12 feet wide, 10 feet deep, and they had 2 rooms on the first floor and then 2 rooms on the second floor. And at the rear was a single-story wood shed where there would have been, maybe a toilet and maybe a water hydrant, and this is what served as the kitchen. So this is the typical alley dwelling that was then built for the next 20 years until 1892, when the construction of alley dwellings was banned. So while the laws that were adopted really improved the quality of construction in alley dwellings, they still did not require sewage connections, indoor plumbing, or heat. And also the regulations, even though they changed the nature of the types of alley dwellings, it did not stymie their construction. And there were hundreds and really literally thousands of alley dwellings that were constructed in the early 1880s up until 1892 when they were banned. In 1897, there were 18,978 people living in the alleys, and 93% of these were poor and African American. In addition, these, even though these codes kind of improved some of the conditions, none of the health codes were enforced. And so even though there was a possibility for them being more sanitary, they really became very unsanitary very fast. And so these really unhealthful conditions just persisted. From the late 19th and into the mid 20th century, black and white leaders alike condemned the city's alleys as slums and places of evil. In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt called the city's alleys breeding grounds of decay. And black sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois proclaimed inhabited alleys to be deadly to civilization. Just as the newspaper Colored American opined, alley life in Washington contributes more to crime and suffering than any other source of evil. But although we know that they were condemned by both blacks and whites in the city, most of what we know about alley life comes from studies that were undertaken by white progressive era sociologists and government agents who were intent upon eliminating the alley dwellings. Their reports had photographs such as those that are shown here. They provided excruciating details on the squalor, the unconventional family compositions, the high levels of unemployment, disease, and criminal activity in the alleyways. And these reports, quite frankly, are very hard to read. They're just filled with incredible racial bias and just really paternalistic language. So this is like one lens for understanding the alleys. However, a close examination of the record reveals that others documenting the city's alleys had a different perspective on alley life. There was a minister in the early 1900s from Shiloh Baptist Church. His name was Reverend Waldron. He was the founder of the Alley Improvement Association, and he recognized that alleys provided a home and a safe space for the city's poorest residents. And in the 1930s, and Daniel Sweeney, who was a PhD student, interviewed many alley residents as part of his dissertation. And he found that most people who lived in the alleys liked living in the alleys. And they were really connected to their communities, and most of them did not want to leave. And then there was a photographer who was a photographer of these two photographs here in the 1940s who was photographing a lot of alleys, especially in Southwest. And he later recalled, "I was amazed when I first saw these alley houses, monotonous, drab, 2-story brick houses stretching a block long and people spilling out of the doorways directly onto the street. He soon discovered a specialness to the alleys, and he admitted, even though my initial motive was to reveal inadequate housing, poverty, and squalor, there was something else I was seeing too, and I attempted to capture it." And here you can see two of those photographs where he's capturing this alley life. This is actually a church service that's happening in the alleyway, and you can see everyone is dressed up. This little girl has on her white Sunday dress, and they've pulled out chairs and are waiting for the minister. to give his sermon. And here, children are just playing in this minor street and alley, also in Southwest. And just a couple more photographs showing that sort of sense of community and life in the alleyways. This is a photograph that was taken by an FSA photographer, the Farm Security Administration photographer, whose name was Edwin Roscom. And this was taken in the early 1940s, and part of the goal of these FSA photographers was to illustrate life in urban and rural America. And these photographs, when you start looking at them, really do show that sense of community that existed in the alleys. The alley itself is really a sort of central commons. It is where people worked and played. And in this particular photograph, the caption lets us know that the children are helping unload boxes from this truck, and the boxes are to be used for firewood to burn in their house stoves. But what's so great, too, about the photos, you can see how much everybody is a part of this alley life. There are people in the windows. Here's an adult looking out and monitoring the situation, and children looking on, probably with excitement, wishing they were out there, but maybe they weren't old enough. But the windows in these pictures are often open, and people lived within the alleyway as much as in the house. And here's a perfect example of that. This is a family who lives in the alley who was posing for the photographer, Ed Roscom, in front of their house. And here you can see, which was quite common, alley dwellers would bring furniture outside and would sit in the alleyway almost as if it was their living room. And the alley really became very much the center of life. But alleyways were not entirely inhabited by people. Alley dwellers shared the spaces with horses and their stables, workshops and warehouses and manufacturing plants and other commercial and industrial activities. So these alleys were not only inhabited spaces by people, but they were the centers of DC's commerce and industry. This is Nails Alley. It's been demolished, but it was across from Northern Liberties Market, which you can see in the background here. Northern Liberties Market was at 5th and K Street, and it became very much the center of a mercantile community. And you can see here, just in this particular alley, all of the different types of buildings. The end building was actually an ice refrigeration plant. There are alley dwellings here, garages and stables here, and warehouses for the storage of goods next to it. So as we all know, DC was not an industrial city, but we did produce a lot of what we consumed. And we consumed a lot of bread, we consumed a lot of milk. This was a dairy bottling plant, and this bottling plant was down in southeast Capitol Hill. It's called the Simpson Walker Hill Dairy. And these oxen would be taken to Union Station. And from Union Station, all of the milk had been brought in from the countryside, and they would carry these huge barrels of milk back to the alleyway, where then it was bottled and distributed, and then distributed by horse-drawn carriage out to the restaurants and hotels and individual houses. But so this is a great photograph just showing the kind of activity that was taking place in these alleys, not just people living there, but animals occupying some of the buildings, and just teeming with activity for that commerce or business. One of the probably largest alley businesses in the late 19th century during the horse era was the commercial livery stable. And you probably all are familiar with the fact that this livery stable in Naylor Court is the DC Archives building. There were livery stables all throughout the city, not just in alleyways, but there were quite a few in the alleyways. But the owner of this one was Benjamin Macaulay, and he was considered an authority on horses, and he was really well regarded for his high quality of horse care. And this was one of the largest liveries in DC. Depends which article you read. It either had stalls for 80 horses or 200 horses, so take your pick. But either way, you can imagine just the amount of activity with people coming to either rent a horse, rent a carriage, have their horse shod, and just, horses coming back in after having been out, being watered and brushed and taken care of. Constant activity from sun up to sundown. Here is one of the surviving livery stables. This is called the Proctor Alley Livery Stable, and it's just south of Logan Circle. It's been converted into condominiums. So yeah, this is actually an addition to the building. One thing I like about this photograph, though, is you can see the horse stall windows on the second floor. And it was actually not uncommon to have horse stalls on the second floor because the ground level would have been reserved for the carriages, easier to get the carriages, on the first floor than upstairs. But there would be wooden ramps, and the horses would walk up the ramps to the upper levels. So when the end of the horse era and the rise of the automobile came along, it left many of the former alley stables vacant. And so these vacant stables found new use. There were restaurateurs and artists and other creatives who were seeking affordable space, and they adapted these obsolete buildings to new uses. In the 1910s and 20s, there were several artists, fairly large artist communities that grew up in the alleys from downtown to DuPont Circle to Georgetown. And one of these venues was called the Crazy Cat Club. This is here. The Crazy Cat Club was located in Greens Court, which is just south of M Street between 13th and 14th. And it was a bohemian speakeasy. It was run by an artist who was he was a painter. His name was Cleon Throckmorton. And he actually was local Washingtonian, gone to McKinley High School. He eventually moved to New York to become a set designer, but in the late 19-teens and early 20s, he ran the speakeasy. And a reporter described Throckmorton as some lost pre-Raphaelite, fallen by mistake into the Capitol. And the journalist then described the club, and he said, it was as weird and crazy as its name. It's furnished with rustic handmade furniture, lit with candles, and warmed by a blazing open fire. It featured a well-used dance floor and theatrical space. And he said, its real draw, however, was the garden courtyard and treehouse, a spreading tree with airy rookeries built in branches reached by a 12-rung ladder. And waiters ferried drinks up the ladder to clubgoers seated at the treehouse's only table. So here you see the treehouse table and the waiter ferrying the drinks up. So this was the Crazy Cat Club. It eventually closed, but it was there for up until, I think, 1928 or so, and then Cleon Throckmorton went up to New York to become a set designer. His girlfriend was a sketch artist, later his wife, and her name was Catherine Cat Mullins. So I'm pretty certain that the name Crazy Cat Club was named for her. And here is a surviving building in Greens Court today, site of the Crazy Cat Club. So just to back up here a little bit, you can see here this overhanging eave, the two-story height, the horse stall windows there. And here you have the same building, the overhanging eave, and the horse stall windows there. And this is now the site of the Green Lantern, which is a nightclub of sorts. Of sorts, yes. I've never been there, so I can't say. Yeah. But the Crazy Cat Club was just one of the city's many artistic alley communities. In the early 1920s, St. Matthew's Court, which is right behind St. Matthew's Cathedral on Rhode Island Avenue, became a major artistic hub, and it remained so into the 1960s. In 1934, there was a newspaper reporter who was exploring the city's alleys, and he described St. Matthew's Court. Here live painters and sculptors. In these studios, which were formerly stables, dwell artists, those gay devils supposed to have a peculiar genius for loose living and hell-raising in general. But while New York's Greenwich Village has free love and Paris's Latin Quarter has bacchanalian orgies, the capital's bohemian has only decorum, peace, and a certain quaint, full-flavored beauty. So there you go. We've always been kind of dull here, right? But here are two of the artist studios from St. Matthew's Court. This was the sculptor George Julian Zolnay, who became quite a well-known sculptor, did sculptures throughout the United States, including the sculpture and the pediment of the Nashville Parthenon, if you've ever been. And here, this is a photograph of him in his studio in St. Matthew's Court, and he's actually working on one of his sculptures to a fallen World War I soldier that was also part of Centennial Park in Nashville. And then this is Edward Rowan at Wright, who also had a studio in St. Matthew's Court. So I think it's just really kind of great to see these artists in their studios and seeing these studios imagined from stables to artist studios. And then I just like this particular alley as well. It became an artist community in the late 1940s and 50s. It's in Georgetown. It's a 3300 block on the south side of P Street. And it was a community of women artists, and they called it Artists Alley. And there were about 4 or 5 different women artists who worked and lived there, and they together opened the Artists Mart in Georgetown, which existed into the 60s and 70s, which was a way to encourage local art, have people buy local art, and so they had exhibits there, and they also had exhibits in the alleyway. But these stables are still occupied today as residences, but I don't know if they're artists who live there or not. But it's a really nice, quiet alley. And then another photograph of sculptor Paul Bartlett in his alley studio. This one no longer survives, and this is down in Eckington neighborhood. But again, I just love this photograph because here he is doing his plaster model for the tympanum of the U.S. House of Representatives in this studio space in Eckington, and here he is standing in front of that studio space in Eckington. But this close-up view, here he is with the tympanum in front of him, and it's just such a dichotomy between this very minor little vernacular industrial building and then this grand classical tympanum. So meanwhile, while entire communities of artists were moving into the alleys with no repercussions from city officials, housing reformers in the early 20th century just continued their relentless campaign to displace the longtime alley dwellers and eradicate all of the city's surviving alley buildings. So they were successful in that in 1934, the Alley Dwelling Act was passed by Congress. They created something called the Alley Dwelling Authority, and the Alley Dwelling Authority was given 10 years to eliminate and eradicate every surviving alley dwelling in the city. So the Alley Dwelling Authority went about doing it sort of, piecemeal, alley by alley. There were, at the time when it was established in 1934, there were over 225 alleys that still were inhabited. So they just were kind of going one by one. So in some cases, the Alley Dwelling Authority did replace the alley dwellings with sanitary housing. It's called sanitary housing because it had plumbing and electricity. But in many more cases, and in the process, they would rehouse some of the alley dwellers. But for the most part, they just displaced the residents, left them to their own devices to find new housing, and in the place of the alley dwellings, they mostly built garages. So this is an example on Douglas Court. This was a row of alley dwellings that was demolished. There were 11 dwellings that were demolished for garages. So it's kind of hard to see because the angles are different, but this edge here of the two walls there is where this alley dwelling stood. So these alley dwellings were replaced by this garage. There's another garage that also replaced another row of alley dwellings. But so that was the trend, that the Alley Dwelling Authority was just replacing houses with garages for the most part. So they were supposed to eliminate all of the alley dwellings in the 10-year period, but because of World War II, it got in the way, and plus there was sort of a change in mission of the Alley Dwelling Authority. They had not completed their task, and so they were given another 10 years to complete it. Actually 11 years. They were given to 1955 to complete the task. So in those intervening years, beginning really in the late 1940s, a lot of young white professionals were moving into the city. They were attracted to our historic neighborhoods. They liked the historic character of Georgetown and Capitol Hill and Foggy Bottom, and they started renovating the houses in these historic areas, including the alley dwellings. And so they just began investing in these properties. They brought in the sewage, they brought in electricity, and they fixed the houses up. They basically gutted them down to their brick walls and put kitchens in and put bathrooms in. And so what happened was then when the time came to for the city to kick all of the alley dwellers out, these new white professionals who were living in the alleys rose up in protest and lobbied against this act that was to eliminate the alley dwellings. And they were successful, and so the Alley Dwelling Act was overturned, and so the city no longer was out to demolish the dwellings because they were now occupied by white professional class people. So here is a newspaper article talking about one of the first examples of the renovation. These are the houses after renovation. Basically showing the slums before and then the repairs underway. This next photo, this one is on Capitol Hill, and this next image is a newspaper article talking about an alley in Georgetown, and it says, the headline is, "Condemned Slum in Georgetown Alley Goes Hi-Hat as Pomander Walk." And so what happened is, because here they are, this is the residents who are being kicked out. Many of them had been longtime residents, had lived in the alley for more than 30 years. They're just displaced overnight. Not only overnight, but it was like Christmas Eve. And then this is a photograph of the alleys after they were renovated. And of course, the people who then moved into the renovated alley dwellings didn't really want to be associated with the term alley. So many of them got together and changed the name. This was Bell's Court. Or Bell's Alley or Court, they were kind of interchangeable, and they changed the name to Pomander Walk, which it remains today. And that's the, condemned slum in Georgetown Alley goes Hi-Hat as Pomander Walk. So anyway, that basically is, a story that keeps repeating itself. So as a result, though, of the overturning of the Alley Dwelling Act, it did mean that there are 108 19th century alley dwellings that still survive. And those are the alley dwellings that I was particularly interested in understanding when we started out doing our building survey. In some instances, I would say, the history of Washington's alleys is being interpreted by individuals and nonprofits. This is a photograph of the DC Alley Museum. This was a row of alley dwellings that were later converted to garages, but it's now the DC Alley Museum, which is actually an outdoor museum, and they get grants to do murals and the like, and many of those murals have a historic interpretive component. And then here there are individuals. This is an example of an individual who converted this old stable into a residence. But in the process, he found an old ghost sign, and he, repainted it. So kind of brings alive some of the past history. But for the most part, the history of our alleys is not apparent. It's not being interpreted, in the physical realm. And so that was part of the reason for my wanting to do the book, was to let people know when they're out dining at Katie's Alley, which I do regularly, love Katie's Alley, or in Blagden Alley, that you at least, kind of have an understanding of the past and what our alleys were before they become, reimagined as Michelin star restaurants and and coffee shops. But so that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. happy to take questions. I think the mic is coming around. So.
Hi, how are you? My name is Carl Cole. I was born and reared in Southwest Washington, across from what was noted as the world's most notorious slum. That was the caption on the daily news, the Script Harrods newspaper. Interesting enough that, first of all, what you call stables, I call the equestrian centers. No, seriously, I still ride today. I still champion the Washington International Horse Show. I see you looking for me, Knight. I'm right back here. Let's take Dixon Court, the world's most notorious slum. When they started the deconstruction of Southwest in 1954, it's funny, I can think of 2 Air Force pilots, the Boone School in Farallon, which was named after Lawrence Boone. They came out of Dixon Court, okay? Why do I call them equestrian centers versus stables? That's where my first experience, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Hezekiah, who taught me how to handle a horse, how to mount one, and everything, and how to ride as a gentleman, okay? So, yeah, I appreciate you've done an excellent job, but alleys are far more than that. If you look at European histories of alleys, you'll find it was very much the same pattern throughout. One of the places that you exhibited there was only a few blocks from where my late father-in-law was raised, in Georgetown. And his family goes back to Georgetown before there was a US of A. So yeah, it was all of that, but then it was other portions of it that most people would never recognize, would never want to agree that it exists. And that was one of the premise for demolishing most of Southwest, allegedly because of its alley population. And you know what? If I could have another life, I would want my neighborhood with Dixon Court and everything else to be exactly the same. I would want the same neighbors that lived in Dixon Court. There was Dr. Leonard, a PhD psychologist, who lived in Dixon Court. Why did he live in an alley? Back in the 20s and 30s, no one really needed Negro psychologists. And he did what he had to do to survive. He was a champion of changing the DC Police Department. They would always arrange for him to go to Cherry Prison, which was right off of Willow Tree, by the way. And what he did, he used to coach the black officers to pass the test to elevate up the rank to corporal, sergeant, and so on. So while others may read this, and I think you've done an excellent job, I would have an entirely different interpretation of alley life here. I look at Europe, I look at Barcelona and places like that. As a matter of fact, how many of you are familiar with the wharf?
Yeah, the wharf.
One of the things I hear people when we're over there and people are talking, says, you know, this reminds me of the alleyways of Barcelona. Guess what? We looked at the alleyways of Barcelona when we were studying how to do the wharf. So it's a good job, but there's always another cultural and intellectual side that unless you've lived there and experienced it, you would never understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. I think Dixon Court definitely was cited in newspaper articles as being, the absolute worst, most nefarious alley. But then, I mentioned Daniel Sweeney, who did his PhD dissertation. He interviewed people who lived in the alleyways in the 1930s, and he interviewed people who lived in Dixon Court, and they said, just like you said, one of them said, I'm kind of embarrassed being from Dixon Court. I'm kind of embarrassed to say I'm from Dixon Court, but I loved Dixon Court, and I wouldn't ever want to leave Dixon Court. I couldn't wait to get back to Dixon Court when I was out of Dixon Court. So I hope that I feel like I left the wrong impression that I was only giving one perspective on alley life, but my book does sort of point out this dichotomy of perspectives that the white progressive reports on the desire to eliminate the alleys was giving a very biased perspective, whereas you could glean from, some of these other people like Reverend Waldron, who ran the Alley Improvement Association, that there was this really vital life in the alleys, and people, then it was a real community. Yeah.
And Nancy, let me add this. Also, if you ever do another study, please make sure you include the racial construct. Mm-hmm. I went to school with just as many white children who lived in alleys as blacks.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, it was a small percentage in D.C., but this was a white alley for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was 93% of the alley inhabitants in D.C. were black after the 1870s. So, but yeah, thank you.
Washington sculptor Felix de Weldon did sculptures all over the city. He had a alley studio in Eckington. I saw it about 50 years ago. It was enormous. It was chock full of his plaster of Paris models, and had a huge plaster of Paris statue of General John J. Pershing that he was trying to sell to the government. He never sold to the government, but it was enormous. And then the studio was all in bad shape. People were stealing out of it. The windows were broken out, and it went away somewhere. But
yeah, it was demolished, I think, in the 90s or something, because I remember seeing it. But yeah, I saw the building before it was demolished. Yep.
Did they have official addresses?
That's a good question. So alleys did have names, but they weren't named officially necessarily. And so originally, alleys were often, it would be like the alley behind, 9th Street between S and T or whatever. But then they were named eventually, sometimes officially, if a developer went in and actually built alley dwellings like Groff Court and Guestford Court on Capitol Hill. Those alley dwellings were built by developers, and they named the alley after themselves. So they did have names, and the houses did have numbers. Some of the alleys just got names either through like census takers who were doing the census or by the community around them. And so some of them were named for nearby businesses, like ice. One was Ice Alley because there was an ice manufacturing plant nearby. Zigzag Alley, it was zigzag shape. So, but they are not official names. But so some of them were officially named when they were platted later. Some of them just had names colloquially. Yes.
Hi. Kim, what did you learn in your research about the real estate business of alley dwelling construction, development, and rental after they were built? Was it a large-scale enterprise? Did builders and developers buy up all of the backs of lots, create the lots, build the houses, and who owned them and collected rents on these thousands of residents?
That's a very good question, and generally speaking, it was all very small scale. There were instances in the late 19th century where, yes, a developer or builder like Groff or Guestford on Capitol Hill did go back. They managed to buy the land, subdivide it, and build alley dwellings. But for the most part, it was piecemeal. And in fact, there were studies that were done, by these humanitarians who discovered that in most alleys, there was a different owner for each and every alley dwelling. So it wasn't like a big, developer-driven business. But it was people who were buying, they saw it and thought they had an opportunity for an investment opportunity, and they bought in. But many of those owners actually didn't even visit the properties, and that was part of the problem. They were falling into disrepair because the owners didn't really have any interest in it. They'd sort of bought it as an investment and then forgot about them or whatever. In the meantime, the owners are renting the properties at a greater return on investment than even the street houses. So even though the alley dwellings were the cheapest form of housing and the poorest residents could only afford to live in the alleys, percentage-wise on their income, they were paying, a much higher rate than people who were living outside the alleys. But then on top of it, there were often 2 and 3 different people in between the owners and the renters who were subletting and tacking on price on top. So there's one example in this early 20th century report that I read where the owner was someone who lived out in the suburbs somewhere. She rented it to a grocer who had a grocery store on the first floor. The grocer then doubled the price and rented the upstairs to several different families. And then, of course, the families then would often sublet rooms to try and have enough money to pay the rent. So in some cases, the prices were exorbitant because of all of the cut in the rent. But so from a rent perspective, the owners were making money, and on the backs of the poorest residents, of course. Yes, Bill.
Hello. Great job. There's a lot of great information.
Thanks.
Do I need that? No. All right. I have one question and one comment.
Yeah.
9.5 Street Northwest, was that one of the alleys that they named street name because of the dwelling units, the people in it?
Yeah, it's funny because it was actually always 9.5 Street. I mean, it may not have had a name originally, but it was never an alley. It always
never an alley?
it wasn't. It's not really a minor street either because it doesn't go all the way through. It goes in and stops.
Then it zigzags.
But but I tried to find out if it had a name before it became 9.5 Street, but I couldn't find another name for it. It was always 9.5 Street.
There's a few of your shots looks just like the buildings at 9.5 Street Northwest.
Yeah.
It's worth going to see if it's nearby for folks who want to do that.
Yeah.
Other comment is it's funny how things come back around because I'm an architect, so I know a little bit about zoning. You could have an alley dwelling if the alley was 30 feet wide or greater, right? Because there was fire department access, I think, mostly. And that was allowed, but now with the ADUs, for the same reasons the alley dwellings were there to provide more housing for people when it was needed, we're trying to do the same kinds of things with the ADUs, and the alley dwellings are coming back in vogue. Maybe the door's on the inside of the lot rather than the outside of the lot, but it's still, you're allowed to do a 2-story structure like that for an ADU, which is an accessory dwelling unit.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that, it's not going to solve our housing crisis in DC at all, but I think, the change in zoning that allows for alley dwellings is a good thing. So.
Hi, thanks so much. This is the third time I've heard you talk about your book, and it's always fascinating. In Snow's Court and Foggy Bottom, we have Wilbur Nash Stable, and we recently found a picture from 1914, the time the stable was built, with the Department of Commerce sign hanging on it. Are you familiar with Department of Commerce stables, and what are they doing there?
So, I don't know, and you mentioned that to me, I think, in an email. I do know that a lot of these stables were then, like the federal government rented them because I don't know why the Department of Commerce needed a stable, but they had obviously a fleet of horses and they needed to stable them. And so that wasn't uncommon that a private stable would be rented by a government entity of sorts. So, for instance, the DC sanitation office obviously had to house their horses that did the street cleaning, and so they would rent livery stables from individuals, or not livery stables, but large commercial stables. So, I have no idea what the Department of Commerce needed horses for, but
I'll let you know if I find it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Last question. Hi, Bill Rice.
Hey,
Good
Bill.
to see you. I find something missing, as fascinating as your talk is, which will make me come to your next talk, because you're going to fill in some names of people who you just referred to as activists, reformers, do-gooders.
Yes.
I would like, though, to ask you specifically about Eleanor Roosevelt's role, if you can be very brief about it, and the Supreme Court William O. Douglas decision about Southwest, that the government can buy high and sell low in the name of eliminating blight. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the book does name names for sure, because it wasn't just, government agencies or whatever that were involved in these efforts to eradicate dwellings. There were people behind those efforts. And obviously there were some important people, Eleanor Roosevelt and Ellen Wilson also, both very involved in the effort to eliminate the slums of DC, what they called the slums. But their goals were really more about eliminating the blight, as you say, and they did not have necessarily a solution for where the displaced residents would go. And so their efforts were really on opening the alleys up, turning them into parks or minor streets, so that the blind alley aspect of the alleys was eliminated, so that they were visible, that they thought for the most part that one of the problems with the alleys is they were not visible from the public street, so they wanted to open them up entirely. And so Eleanor Roosevelt played a big role. She did, obviously because of her political and social standing, was able to get members of Congress to come out and see the alleys. She took them on tours of alleyways to see the conditions that people were living in the alleys, which catapulted many of the federal government efforts to eliminate alleys. Ultimately resulted in the 1934 Alley Dwelling Act, but there were several other congressional acts along the way. One of them, which passed in 1914, was called the Ellen Wilson Act, sort of colloquially, because she had really pushed it on her deathbed with her husband. And so but Eleanor Roosevelt's role is a little less known, I think, than Ellen Wilson. Ellen Wilson played a much greater role. And in terms of Southwest, Southwest alleys, obviously Southwest, the whole idea of the urban renewal of Southwest is, just a story, a terrible story of displacement and redevelopment. I didn't focus on it so much, just because it's a completely different pattern and trend in the history of alleys. It was just, it was a federal government, one of the first and largest urban renewal efforts, and it just eliminated the entire area for super blocks and new housing, and the alleys were a byproduct of that elimination, but it was less focused than elsewhere with the Alley Dwelling Act.
Thank you.
So for more details on guessing names and details and other stories, the book is available in the back. Much more detail there. Kim is going to have books that I'm sure she'll be happy to sign for them. So please make a stop. You can look at the book on your way out. I'm going to thank Kim, and we have a certificate of appreciation for you for coming and for not only giving us a great presentation, but also handling all of our comments as well as questions. So we thank you. Thank you so much. We'll do it after. We'll do a picture after. Next month, we have a speaker coming from the Rainbow History Project who's going to be talking to us about LGBTQIA locations in D.C. that have disappeared. So if you're interested in the built environment, we have more next month. Go forth, enjoy. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for participating.